So welcome and thank you for joining us for Outsmarting Antisemitism. Today we are doing lesson 3, and the title of today's lesson is The Promised Land. And of course, whereas the prior 2 lessons, we spoke about antisemitism as a whole, how ancient it is, how we beat it on a personal psychological level with bitachon, trust in God, with Jewish pride, how where it comes from in an anti-Semite, and what we can do if we know someone, or not even if we know someone, what we can do to stop the trends of anti-Semitism by standing proud for our identity, and how that helps not only to stop hatred against Jews, but to stop hatred against other minorities, etc. So that's what we've been doing for the first 2 lessons. Now, today, we're going to take a very strong, very sharp turn, and we're going to take this conversation from the historic into the modern, okay? And today, the most modern form of anti-Semitism is hatred of the Jewish people that centers around Israel. And we're going to ask the question, why does so much hatred center on the land of Israel? Why does it spur hatred in those that hate us? We're going to start with a little video on this topic. Those of you that were at the Israel course will find parallels between this video, as well as in general throughout the lesson today that we will make between this lesson and the lesson in the Israel course when we spoke briefly about anti-Semitism. In other words, this is a course on anti-Semitism. We're spending one lesson on Israel. That was a lesson on Israel. That was a course on Israel. We spent 1 lesson on anti-Semitism. So you'll find a lot of overlap between those 2 lessons. So it'll serve as a good review. So please turn your attention to the video screens.
On the eastern shore of Manhattan Island, the United Nations headquarters rises from a row of colored flags that represent a multitude of nations. Across the avenue, the Isaiah Wall proclaims a Jewish prophet's vision of universal peace. They shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. The UN's mission is precisely that, to resolve armed conflicts and to foster global harmony. But inside the august chambers of the United Nations, founded in 1945 as a response to a war-ravaged world desperate for coexistence, Isaiah could have easily found himself the target of virulent condemnation had he survived into modern times. Isaiah lived in ancient Israel that for over a millennia included the territories that the UN considers illegally occupied by today's Jewish state. The Temple Mount that lies at the heart of Isaiah's prophecy is no longer considered by the UN to be the heritage or possession of the Jewish people. Indeed, the tiny country that Isaiah called home has become the focus of the majority of the UN's denunciations and has inspired more censure than all of today's tyrants put together. Iran, North Korea, and other brutal regimes systematically kill their citizens or deny them the most basic of human rights. Israel's northern neighbor, Syria, has murdered tens of thousands of innocent civilians. Apparently, however, that isn't very important in the eyes of the UN General Assembly and Security Council, who continually pass one-sided resolutions that single out and condemn Israel. An overwhelmingly powerful bloc led by the Arab nations promotes a narrow and slanderous agenda meant to isolate Israel. This agenda has met little resistance. The UN's General Assembly votes on 70 to 100 resolutions annually. 15 to 20 of these regularly express disapproval of Israel. From 2016 until 2020, the Assembly adopted 122 resolutions criticizing various countries. 91 of these targeted Israel. That's 75% of all country-specific resolutions. And while 3/4 of this global forum's written rage lambastes the Jewish state, precious few of the most repressive or blood-soaked regimes on earth have received even a single rebuke. Emergency special sessions of the Assembly are rare. During the last 40 years, they've been convened for one purpose only: to condemn Israel. The Assembly's embrace of a terrorist entity has been equally astounding. In October 1974, 14 years, Liberation Organization even nominally forswore terrorism. The Assembly voted to invite a PLO spokesman to take part UN infamously approved Resolution 3379, branding Zionism as a form of racism. At the time, Israel's UN ambassador, Chaim Herzog, told his fellow delegates that Hitler would have felt at home listening to the UN debate on the measure.
For us, the Jewish people, this is no more than a piece of paper, and we shall treat it as such.
Since the 1993 Oslo Accords, hundreds of Israelis have been killed and thousands injured by Palestinian terror attacks. During the same period, the UN passed dozens of resolutions deploring Israel, but not one against the terror attacks. Since the 2006 creation of the UN's Human Rights Council, most of the world's human rights abusers have suffered nary a mild rebuke. Israel, on the other hand, is chastised as often as all of the rest of the countries combined, and in terms more condemnatory. At the Council's every meeting, a topic billed as, quote, human rights situation in Palestine and other occupied Arab territories, is raised as a separate agenda item, while the remaining totality of mankind constitutes a single other point on the agenda. From 2006 to May 2021, Israel was condemned in no less than 94 Human Rights Council resolutions. During the same period, Syria was condemned 36 times, North Korea 14 times, and China has been spared condemnation altogether. Even within the walls of the UN, the absurdity of its anti-Israel bias is fleetingly, partially acknowledged. In September 2006, UN Secretary-General Kofi Annan conceded.
Supporters of Israel feel that it is harshly judged by standards that are not applied to its enemies. And too often this is true, particularly in some UN bodies.
In August 2013, UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon reflected on Israel's treatment at the UN.
There are some bias against the Israeli people and government.
In December 2016, he told the UN Security Council,
A disproportionate volume of resolutions, reports, and conferences criticizing Israel.
One of the more telling comments came inadvertently in November 2013, when a UN interpreter failed to silence her microphone as she addressed her colleague.
I mean, I think when you have 5 statements, not 5, like a total of 10 resolutions on Israel and Palestine, there's got to be something. C'est un peu trop, no? I mean, I know it's yes, it's right, but it's not there's other really bad happening. Nobody says anything about the other stuff. Apologies.
Okay, I understand there was a problem with interpretation.
Israel is not larger than 8,019 square miles in total. It is the Middle East's only functioning democracy and champion of human rights. It is a world provider of humanitarian disaster relief and medical, agricultural, ecological, scientific, technological, and security innovations. But when seen through the lens of historical UN bias, the overwhelming majority of all the world's evils and all of the world's ills belong to the tiny Jewish homeland in which Isaiah spoke his vision of swords being beaten into plowshares.
And so, of course, that leads us to the conversation that we'd like to have today, which is, why is it that So why is it that most anti-Semitism in the world today revolves around Israel? I think it's also important to point out right about now that not all criticism of Israel is automatically anti-Semitism. It's always a very important thing to make sure to acknowledge. In fact, the biggest criticizers of Israel and of Israeli government policy, etc., are often Jews, particularly the Israelis. But that doesn't take away from the fact that a lot of the criticism of Israel comes from an anti-Semitic perspective. And we're going to talk a little bit about how we differentiate between those two momentarily. For now, I'd like to open up with text 1. Mickey, if you can read for us, please, which is Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs in his article for the Jewish Chronicle, Future Tense, the New Anti-Semitism. What is it and how do we deal with it? We are on page 84.
84, okay. A mutating virus. Anti-Semitism is not an ideology, a coherent set of beliefs. It is, in fact, an endless stream of contradictions. The best way of understanding it is to see it as a virus. Viruses attack the human body, but the body itself has an immensely sophisticated defense, the human immune system. How then do viruses survive and flourish? By mutating. Anti-Semitism mutates and in so doing defeats the immune system's setup by cultures to protect themselves against hatred. Most people at most times feel a residual guilt at hating the innocent. Therefore, anti-Semitism has always had to find legitimation in the most prestigious source of authority at any given time. In the first centuries of the Common Era, and again in the Middle Ages, this was religion. That is why Judeophobia took the form of religious doctrine. In the 19th century, religion had lost prestige and the supreme authority was now science. Racial anti-Semitism was duly based on two pseudosciences: social Darwinism, the idea that in society as in nature, the strong survive by eliminating the weak, and the so-called scientific study of race. By the late 20th century, science had lost its prestige, having given us the power to destroy life on Earth. Today, this supreme source of legitimacy is human rights. That is why Jews, or the Jewish state, are accused of the 5 primal sins against human rights: racism, apartheid, ethnic cleansing, attempted genocide, and crimes against humanity.
Thank you. So like a virus, anti-Semitism throughout the generations, he points out, has mutated in the classical era and Middle Ages. If you'd like, you can follow along on the screen or in your book on page 86. The most prestigious source of authority was religion, and therefore Judaism, right? Or the fact that whether it's that the Jews killed Christ, or whatever the details that they come up with are, right? Whether it was blood libels, all that sort of thing. Think the Spanish Inquisition, just the fact that the Jews wouldn't even convert, right? Never mind what sins the religion is guilty of, right? This was the big in Yiddish they say the big avla, the big crime of the Jewish people. In the 19th century, religion lost its prestige. Now the most prestigious source of authority was science. So based on a few pseudosciences, they came up with a claim that the inferior Jewish race is infecting the superior Aryan race, right? And then, of course, more recently in the late 20th century, human rights became the big thing to champion, right? And then, I mean, we could talk about how human rights became the new most prestigious source of authority, and perhaps that's a good thing even, but that's beyond the scope of today's conversation. But in terms of hating Jews, if we need to hate Jews, then the biggest crime that they have committed is Jews violate human rights. Now, the biggest conversation, hold on. So just to give us a little bit of a feeling of this, in figure 3.2 on page 87, from the Melbourne group, we see they asked the following question. which of the following best describes you? Are you, right? They gave a spectrum here, going from very pro-Israel, very supportive of the current Israeli government policies, all the way down to not pro-Israel, not pro the government's policies. And in between, maybe you're critical of some, maybe you're critical of many, right? And as you can see, the result on page 87 is that 59% of those surveyed were pro-Israel, but critical of at least some government policies. In other words, a large percent were some. Beyond that, there was more that were critical of many of the policies, and then there were those that were critical of the entire state of Israel. But the question is, if it goes across such a broad spectrum, if there's so many people involved in this conversation, are we in fact accusing 59% of the population of being anti-Semitic? Not that we have any qualms with doing so. Just are we in fact saying that anybody that criticizes Israel is in fact anti-Semitic? Which leads us to the question, which obviously is how you have to start any conversation about anti-Israel bias or anti-Zionism as a whole, anti-Israel as a country, delegitimizing the state of Israel, etc. How do we differentiate those that do that legitimately from a place of love, and they love Jewish people, but they have something wrong with the state of Israel? Because we're not closed to the idea that Israel may have flaws or that Israel may even be doing wrong things, and it's fine for people to criticize that. But when do we cross the line and say, you're not just being anti a particular government, you're not just anti particular policy because they do X, Y, and Z, but you're actually anti-Semitic? When does that happen? And I think the best way of summarizing this is with text 2. First of all, it's an ancient text. It's from the Medrash. It's not from the oldest Medrash. It's from Kohelet Rabbah, which is a little later, but it's interesting. This is a story that happened with Emperor Hadrian. So Hadrian, of course, ruled from 117 CE to 138 CE. And this tyrant was brutal against the Jewish people living in the Holy Land, and he enacted many, many laws to weaken Judaism. Most of them were following the Bar Kokhba revolt. But here's an interesting insight. The Medrash tells us there was one fella who we know nothing about, by the way. His name was Imi Kantron. Apparently that was his name. And he challenged Emperor Hadrian to his face based on a double standard that he had. Shada, can you read for us, please? We're on page 88.
Imi Kantron wrote to Emperor Hadrian, if it is circumcision that you hate, Arab tribes also circumcise. If it is Shabbat observance that you despise, the Kuthians similarly observe Shabbat. Clearly then, you simply hate the Jewish people. Their God will exact punishment from you.
Hadrian, Yimach Shemo, progressively decreed or put into law various laws against Jewish practice, circumcision, Shabbat, etc. Right? And here he's being challenged by this man. He says, "There's a double standard here. If you think that circumcision is a barbaric thing, which, by the way, when he did, no, that was Antiochus when he did so from a Greek perspective, which we'll talk about later." But often it comes as like, circumcision seems like a barbaric practice. Think of today, for instance. There are those that are against circumcision, right? Oh, it's a barbaric practice. It's abusive to young children, right? No problem. Hadrian, if that's your view, no problem, he says. However, you can't have a double standard. Islam had yet to come on the surface. There was no Islam yet. But Arabs, even before the advent of Islam, circumcised their children. Ever since Ishmael, Avram's son was circumcised. This was a common practice among them. Shabbat, right? The claim is Jews are lazy. That's why they're keeping Shabbat, right? So he decreed that everybody has to work on Shabbat. You're not allowed to rest on the seventh day. Again, he says there's a double standard here. There are people among you, the Kuthians, without getting into who the Kuthians were, according to most authorities, they were a group of people who Sancheiriv, when he exiled the 10 tribes, he brought in a different nation, and that was the Kuthians, whatever, without getting into their whole history. But they lived there at the time in the north of Israel, and they kept Shabbat. So So are you against Shabbat? Are you against circumcision? Or are you against a certain people, and no matter what they do, you're going to find fault with it? So in the modern context, we often see this when it comes to the state of Israel. There's a double standard. Israel is held to a particular standard, and the claim is, no, it's all about human rights. It's all about the fact that Israel is persecuting the Palestinian people. Israel is doing this or that, or whatever it is that Israel is doing wrong, but no one else in the world is held to that standard. So you start to beg the question, are you against any human rights abusers, or could you not give two flying hoots about human rights? Just you need to hate the Jews and you need to make that legitimate. So you use this as a form of making that a legitimate hatred of Jews. Yeah. Nathan Sharansky used this, in other words, the double standards test, as 1/3 of his three-pronged test, how to judge criticism of Israel and figure and determine whether it's anti-Semitic or it's legitimate criticism of Israel. And he came up with what he calls the 3D test. So, Joanne, can I ask you to read for us, please? Text 3, page 89. This is Nathan Sharansky.
Okay. I believe that we can apply a simple test. I call it the 3D test to help us distinguish legitimate criticism of Israel from anti-Semitism. The first D is the test of demonization. When the Jewish state is being demonized, when Israel's actions are blown out of all sensible proportion, when comparisons are made between Israelis and Nazis and between Palestinian refugee camps in Auschwitz, that is anti-Semitism, not legitimate criticism of Israel. The second D is the test of double standards. When criticism of Israel is applied selectively, when Israel is singled out by the United Nations for human rights abuses, while the behavior of known and major abusers, such as China, Iran, Cuba, and Syria, is ignored. When Israel's Magen David Adom alone among the world's ambulance services is denied admission to the International Red Cross, this is anti-Semitism. The third D is the test of delegitimization. When Israel's fundamental right to exist is denied alone among all peoples in the world, this too is anti-Semitism.
Thank you, Joanne. So you can follow along on the screen or in figure 3.3 on page 90 of your book. So he says you gotta treat somebody has a claim against Israel. They're arguing against Israel. Analyze their words, analyze their statements, analyze what they feel is wrong with Israel. If you're spotting one of these three things, you got yourself a major problem. Why? Because as we know, just in regular argument, right? I forget what it's called. Attack of character or character assault,
assassination,
character assassination, something like that. Any thinking person, the moment that they see someone in an argument or in a debate or anything, feel the need to demonize the other person, demonize everything they stand for, demonize everything they say, no problem. That's all fine and dandy. Then you're criticizing what they stand for or what they say or the views that they hold. That's a legitimate form of conversation, of dialogue. The moment you feel the need to demonize them, in this instance, to compare Jews to the worst villains in the world because it's helpful and convenient for your cause in order to demonize them, that's already a telltale sign that there's anti-Semitism going on. It's not just criticism of Israel. Number two, double standards. That's the one we already elaborated on, right? So the UN is a perfect example of this, as we mentioned earlier. And number three is delegitimization. There is no need to delegitimize Israel as a state or the Israeli government as a movement just because they're doing something wrong. Even if they're violating human rights, there's no need to delegitimize them as a country. Even those human rights internationally that are decried, nobody ever says, oh, North Korea is abusing its citizens, therefore North Korea shouldn't be a country. They're our country. They are who they are, right? And then we have to get them to behave properly. The moment there's delegitimization, like, oh, there is no right for any state of Israel to exist, that's when, again, you have a strong form of anti-Semitism. Now that we've come up with, I should mention, by the way, that Sharansky's 3D test, and I want to give a warm welcome to Ron Rohr, who was struggling for a good 15 minutes to get into the classroom, and I want to commend his perseverance.
Hello.
Thank you. And on that note, by the way, also a warm welcome to anybody who was watching the recording. Joanne, I should mention that Annie Sharfstein was watching the recording. She usually comes in person, and last week she couldn't, and she's watching the recording, and she says, "Oh, Joanne Sheraton's too. I didn't know." It's like people see their friends. Anyways, it's an interesting social dynamic. So I was going to mention that Sharansky's test was also adopted as part of the IHRA, which is the International Holocaust Remembrance. I don't know what page it is in your book, but in the appendixes to this lesson, to lesson 3, you'll see, I don't know what page it is, but they have something called the Working Definition of Anti-Semitism. As part of the working definition of anti-Semitism that the International Holocaust Remembrance Association came up with, they included this 3D test in it, and that has been adopted and incorporated to varying degrees in many countries across the world as the definition of anti-Semitism. You can see more about that again in the appendixes to today's lesson. Okay, but having said all that, so now we understand how we can define anti-Semitism, how we can define which criticism of Israel is anti-Semitism. But let's say we define one that is, what can we do about it? Right? What can we do about those that criticize Israel from an anti-Semitic perspective? So a couple of obvious things come to mind. We can be sure to strengthen the position of Jews in Israel economically, by donating, politically, supporting organizations that support Israel, that sort of thing. We can combat the lies and half-truths told about Israel through education. And furthermore, and probably most important, we can engage in the spiritual endeavors which protect our brothers and sisters in the Holy Land, right? We spoke about the idea of putting up a mezuzah, or increasing in Tehillim, or increasing in our prayers, in our Torah study, etc., in honor of those in Israel, particularly when something is going on, to help support them, etc. But I want to take this a little bit of a step further today. Particularly, I would like to focus on one unique part of this problem. In other words, anti-Israel, criticism of Israel, that comes from an anti-Semitic perspective, which is the element that often when it comes to criticizing Israel, the hardest part to swallow is that Jews often join forces with those that are hating Israel. And they too join that movement. And recently, in recent years, we've seen that particularly as I don't want to call it pandemic, but a wave of this begin in young Jewish people on campus. And the reason this is particularly hurtful is because it gives these anti-Semites legitimacy and strength, right? If there's an anti-Semitic movement, even if the Jew doesn't know that, the Jew is not anti-Semitic, but he's Jewish himself. He doesn't hate himself, right? But when he joins this movement, claiming that it's not, or quote unquote proving that it's not anti-Semitic, then he or she gives that movement legitimacy and strength, and that's why it's so hurtful. So in order to appreciate this, we have to appreciate what type of anti-Semitism anti-Israel criticism is. And in order to do that, we have to define the two types of anti-Semitism that we have. So last week we spoke a lot about the ditch mentality, right? The void that an anti-Semite may have within them for lack of feeling purpose in this world. But for the purpose of today's conversation, I'd like to split this a little bit differently. These can both be considered ditch complexes, but let's split it based on two major historic Jewish events, major forms of anti-Semitism against Jews that then led, of course, to two famous Jewish holidays, and they are Purim and Hanukkah. The difference between Purim and Hanukkah is that Purim, again, without talking about where it started from, the ditch complex, etc., Haman anti-Semitism, Haman, didn't want to destroy any sort of belief system of the Jewish people. It was a much more outright anti-Semitism. Hitler, Yamach Shemo, falls into this category. All they wanted to do, all these anti-Semites wanted to do, was to destroy Shana. Warm regards to your cat. Who just strolled.
Warm regards to you too, Rabbi.
Come again?
He sends you warm regards
Yeah.
too.
Yeah.
Very interested in the subject, by the way.
Okay. So Purim anti-Semitism is very straightforward. It's hard to disguise. It's hard to say you're not an anti-Semite. This is the anti-Semitism of the man who walked into the Poway synagogue and shot it up. It's the Pittsburgh synagogue and shot it up. This is the anti-Semitism of those who yelled death to the Jews. This is the anti-Semitism of those. And by the way, this is not for the most part, in broad sweeping terms, most people that are anti-Israel are not this form of anti-Semitism. Of course, there are those people, mainly in the Arab world, who chant death to the Jews, let's annihilate the entire Jewish nation, etc. That is Purim anti-Semitism. I don't think that anywhere in the world would anybody legitimize such a form of anti-Semitism. But then you have, and this is what we like to call davar be'itai. It's a thing in its right time, right? Hanukkah coming up around the corner. A different type of anti-Semitism. Antiochus, or Antiochus, right? Antiochus Epiphanes from the Hanukkah story, never wanted to destroy the Jews. Perhaps, according to some opinions, once the war started, he had an intention to wipe out all the Jews. But his main agenda was to show that the Jewish people are a negative parasite in our society, in our culture. Our society and our culture stands for, the Greeks, right? They stood for worshiping the human body, exercise, the sports, the athletics of the time, right? The Olympics, all this sort of thing. And the Jews, in various ways, circumcision was one of the big ones, by the way, because they were violating the human body, which the Greeks held sacred. Shabbat was another one. The human body, right? The efforts that we put in with our bodies, where we can work hard, etc. Right? And you're just being lazy and not working on Shabbat. So it starts with eradicating specific beliefs and practices, and then it grows and morphs into this whole religious doctrine or body of ideas is terrible. And that's the other form of anti-Semitism. There was a wonderful article in 2019 in Tablet Magazine, which is our next text 4, which really summarizes these two forms of anti-Semitism: Purim and Hanukkah, Haman and Antiochus. Ron, can I ask you to read for us, please? We are on page 91.
Hanukkah anti-Semitism doesn't demand dead or expelled Jews, at least not at first. Instead, it demands the destruction of Jewish civilization. This process requires not dead Jews, but Jews who are willing to give up whatever specific aspect of Jewish civilization is deemed to be uncool. Of course, Judaism has always been uncool, which is why cool people find it so threatening, and why Jews who are willing to become cool and absolutely necessary to Hanukkah-style anti-Semitism's success. In the days of Antiochus, this type of anti-Semitism needed those boys who voluntarily underwent painful genital surgery to prove that Jews weren't the problem, just the barbarity of Jewish law. Hanukkah-style anti-Semitism always promises Jews a kind of nobility, offering them the opportunity to cleanse themselves of whatever the people around them happen to find revolting. The Jewish traits designated as repulsive vary by country and time period, but they invariably contradict the specific values that the surrounding culture has embraced as universal. Thanks to Judaism's inherent uncoolness, there will never be a shortage of Jews willing to comply.
And this is what's so dangerous, and what's so crucial for Hanukkah anti-Semitism to prevail or to persist, is that Jews join that movement. And that's why it doesn't attack Jews per se. It doesn't attack Jews per se. It attacks Jewish values. This is what happened in Hanukkah, as we elaborated upon already, and as she writes here in the article. Another famous example of this is when Jews in the Soviet Union formed the Yevsektia, right? The Jewish section of the Communist Party, and they sought to destroy all that the new cutting edge culture, which was Marxism, etc., found revolting in Judaism. And there are many examples of this throughout history. So most recently, in progressive circles, the biggest issue, the biggest deal that anyone in the world can do is to commit a crime against humanity, or against human rights, etc. Right now, as we said, that might not be a bad thing. But when they start to take these views and to apply them to Israel, all of a sudden it makes it very enticing for Jews to join. Why? Because these Israel haters deny that they hate Jews or Judaism. They say we're happy to accept Jews into the movement. And that's also what makes it particularly hurtful and particularly dangerous. And allow me to summarize. There are three reasons why it's easy for a Jewish youngster or a Jewish thinker to join such a movement. Number one, they don't have to renounce their Judaism. They're not being told Judaism is bad. There are certain elements of Judaism that are bad. Number two, they may even view it as if they're saving Judaism. Look, this is anti-Semitism. If I join their movement, they stop hating me, right? They're not anti-Semitic towards me. If all Jews would join that movement and let go of whatever particular Jewish value it is, notice that I'm refraining from using the term let go of their support of Israel, because it has nothing to do with the support of Israel, right? It could be their support of things that are anti-Marxism, religion, right? It could be their support of something that's anti-Greek culture, circumcision, Shabbat, anything like that. And in all generations, right? And in times of Hanukkah also, one of the biggest forces that helped Antiochus or Antiochus start this movement of anti-Semitism was the fact that there were Jews who were Hellenized, right? Who were Hellenists and took on Greek culture and let go of their Jewish values, etc., as was mentioned in the text. And then, of course, the third reason that it often presents itself as a tempting thing, right? Rabbi Sachs pointed out that it's always counter to the ultimate the ultimate societal value, whatever's being held in highest regard now. He gave three examples, right? Religion, science, and now human rights. So it provides for those that will join the movement a sophisticated worldview. I'm now part of the people. I'm part of the movement of the day. And of course, to us, now, by the way, this will all be very painful, even if the anti-Israel movement applied its resources and focus and it even headed away across the board, right? If, let's say, the anti-Israel movement was also just as equally anti-China and Syria and North Korea, etc., it would be just as painful. The Jews are joining that movement to hate other Jews, etc., and they're lending a hand to that, etc. And then when you start to apply the 3D test, particularly the double standards, that becomes extremely painful. Why? Because if this Jewish person would appreciate that he's joined an anti-Jewish movement, not a movement that's anti-human rights abusers, but an anti-Jewish movement, obviously they would never join. But because it's shrouded in one more layer of blurriness, that's why they join. By the way, throughout the lesson today, I'm going to be talking about those that support anti-Israel movements, even though, of course, this can exist on many levels. There are those that might not become anti-Israel, but they might become more ambivalent about Israel, unwilling to support Israel, whether financially or vocally. They just don't take a side, etc., which to me is equally as sad, because everything we're going to talk about in this lesson applies to them as well. So, of course, the $1 million question on the table is there anything we can do to stop Jews from joining their ranks? And I think that the first and most important thing that we have to do is to make sure that for ourselves, as well as other Jews we encounter, this is a direct call to everyone on this Zoom. If there's a young Jew that you know that has such views, you might want to engage them in conversation and talk about exactly what we're going to talk about for the next 20 minutes, which is explain the Jewish claim to the land of Israel. So let's start off with an exercise. Page 93. Elise, can you give me one reason? What is the basis of the Jewish right to Israel? You're muted. You're still muted. Sorry.
I'm sorry.
There you are.
I would say maybe the earliest is that certain land was given, bought, or won in certain battles and other stories. Abraham buying the cave, it's that. So a lot of it is documented in the Torah itself.
Thank you. Yes, this is one of the commonly cited reasons for why the Jewish people have a claim to the land of Israel. It's called the historical claim. You mentioned a few. There's other things you can mention, not just things that are cited in the Bible. You can also mention historical facts. You can mention archaeology. There's lots of things all as part of it, right? Well-documented historical fact that Jewish people have lived in the land of Israel for many, many years. That is one commonly cited reason for why the Jews have a claim to the land of Israel. Heidi, can you give me another one? Don't forget to unmute yourself.
Oh, what you said, archaeological.
Right, hold on. Heidi, can you give me another one?
No, I'm happy if Elise keeps going.
Okay.
No.
Well, let's hear one from you.
I mean, like ancestral homeland.
That's also historical, right?
Right. And, legally, the creation of the state of Israel in 1948.
Thank you.
The Balfour
Declaration, the League of Nations, the United Nations.
So legalistic reasons.
This is a fact that often goes overlooked because the United Nations is so anti-Israel today. But in 1949, the United Nations actually passed a resolution, which was overwhelmingly passed by all the member countries at the time, acknowledging the legal right to the establishment of the state of Israel. So we have an international legal right to the land of Israel, right? So let's do some of the common arguments here. International law was mentioned, the Balfour Declaration, which eventually led to the British Mandate, which eventually led to the 1948 war, which led to the League of Nations recognizing Israel, and then once the League of Nations was formally formed as the United Nations, them as well. Another one that nobody mentioned was Jewish survival. Even if we wouldn't have an international legal right to the land of Israel or a historical right to the land of Israel, there is the claim that after the Holocaust, it became clear that Jewish people cannot live in disparate countries, around the world, etc., and rely on their host countries to support them or to defend them, etc. Because often when anti-Semitism comes up, there is no one to defend the Jewish people. So giving them their own homeland is the only way for the Jewish people to actually survive. So if we care about human rights, then that's another reason. Anyways, these are three of the commonly held reasons. Now, I don't know that any Jew or non-Jew for that matter that holds anti-Israel sentiment is unaware, sometimes they're unaware of some of these things. But usually, these three reasons are pretty widespread. Usually it's that they have a counter argument to these things. And that's why they still believe that Israel doesn't have the right to exist, or that Israel is a terrible place and an oppressive people, racism, etc., despite these three reasons. And a lot of this has to do with the fact that each of these reasons have a counter argument. Lisa, can I ask you to read for us, please, text 5? So this is a very, very important text. I'm sure we've all heard the quote, "Know thy enemy." In this case, I wouldn't call it an enemy. Phyllis Bennis is a political activist. She's still alive today. She was born in 1951, so I guess that makes her like 70. And she focused mainly on issues related to the Middle East and the United Nations. She was and is a prominent critic of Israel and the United States, and the United States' support of Israel. And she's involved in many organizations that seek to undermine the state of Israel. And that's why I think it's so important to read and appreciate her comments. Lisa, if you can, please, text 5.
Okay.
Oh, hold on.
What?
She's Jewish. If that wasn't clear, I should mention she's Jewish. Okay, go ahead.
When I was a Jewish kid growing up in suburban Los Angeles, we thought being Jewish meant supporting Israel. There wasn't really a choice. If you identified as Jewish, as I and most of my friends did, the religious education we got, the youth groups we joined, and the summer camps where we played were all grounded in one thing. It wasn't God, it was Zionism, the political project of settling Jewish people in Israel. My own break with Zionism came in my mid-20s after reading the letters of Zionism's founder, Theodore Herzl, imploring Cecil Rhodes, the leader of British land theft in Africa, to support his work in Palestine. Their projects were both something colonial, Herzl assured Rhodes.
So what Bennis is referring to here is Cecil Rhodes, of course, was a big financer behind the building of the British Empire in South Africa, and then in general throughout Africa, and he was a strong advocate in white supremacy and British imperialism, etc. And Herzl, when he writes to him, writes that both my project, right, my work in Palestine, and your projects are both something colonial. So therefore, we believe that you should finance this. Now, why Herzl did this, I don't know. Many say that he was just maybe pandering to what Rhodes wanted, etc. But she points out that this was one of the main things that turned her around. Now, Bennis and those like her would hear us today giving 3 reasons for why, or 3 categories of reasons, which each have their subcategories, for why Israel belongs to the Jewish people, and say, hold on a second, I can counter every single one of those arguments. International law, hold on a second, there's a counter argument to that. The Balfour Declaration, who does Balfour think he is to make declarations? It's immoral. The UN resolution, the UN has since revoked it. I'm sorry, not the UN resolution, right? The UN support of the establishment of the state of Israel. If you're listening to the UN, listen to the UN entirely. The UN is constantly condemning Israel for all these sorts of things. Until Israel is willing to listen to what the UN has to say, we don't recognize it from a legal perspective, etc. So don't give me international law. Okay, so you say Jewish survival. Jewish survival? No problem. Go somewhere else, right? This is a very big line that people who are anti-Israel often throw out. Let the Jews go somewhere else. By the way, this was also something that was brought up even by Israel's founding fathers. When they were looking for a place to found the state of Israel, it wasn't necessarily going to be in Israel, right? There were places in Africa that were brought up, Uganda, etc. Right? I'm sure many of us are familiar with this. And to the historical claim, they say, hold on a second. History. So are we about to give back the United States to the Native Americans? No. If the Native Americans just decided to start a war, if they had the ability to do so, and they decided to start a war and wage war against the United States and take it back just because it used to belong to them, we wouldn't support that. That's the way the world works. There are wars, and then there's new people who take over lands, etc. And for Israel to come and do that doesn't generate an eternal right to the land of Israel. Right? Now, there are other counter arguments, by the way. For instance, a counter argument to Jewish survival. Another one is that this might be the worst thing that the Jewish people have ever done. From a logical perspective, of course, from a spiritual perspective, Israel is the safest place that the Jews can ever live. But from a logical perspective, putting all the Jews in one place, right, makes it much easier for forces such as Iran to just wipe them off the map. To the historical claim, another point that can be mentioned is, if you're willing to go so far back in history, go back even further. The land really belongs to the Canaanites. Since the Canaanites are not around, it's not the Jewish peoples. The Jewish people are not indigenous to the land of Israel. The Canaanites are. The Jewish people then conquered it from them. And so what I'd like to end off today is, what can we do to make sure that there are less Jews that are like Phyllis Bennis? Or framed otherwise, what mistakes were made with Phyllis Bennis's upbringing that we can change in the way we are bringing up Jews today to make sure that they're done properly? Please hold. Hi, Menachem. I love you. Thank you for coming to say hi. Say hi.
Hi, Menachem.
Hey, Menachem.
What a big boy.
Okay. Thank you. So before we get to that conversation, I think Mickey had a question.
Actually, Joanne has a comment.
Go ahead.
One of the things that you keep in this course and in the last course that isn't mentioned, and that actually a lot of Jews today don't seem to be aware of, as well as other people in the world, that there has always been a Jewish presence in Palestine, and that gets overlooked, and actually people don't seem to know about it. They think somehow the Jews were, eliminated from whatever by the Romans and then in the Crusades or whatever, but there's always been a continuous Jewish presence in Jerusalem and in Safat, I believe. And I've talked to other people, these are Jews who have no Jewish education. They're not aware of that. They think that somehow in the 1800s, a bunch of Jews from Europe, started emigrating to Israel, and that there weren't Jews there before.
Right.
And I think that needs to be emphasized more.
That's a very, very valid point. I think I mentioned it in the Israel course. I did not mention it today, and we can mention it now, that there was never a time when there were no Jews living in the land of Israel. And even those Jews who didn't live in the land of Israel, if you look through our literature, it's full of Jewish connection to the land of Israel, both in our practice and our rituals, etc., but also in terms of the longing the Jewish people had to go to Israel. If we were ever out of Israel, it was only because we were being kept out of there. But to play devil's advocate, Joanne, 2 points can be mentioned. Number one, there were periods in Jewish history when it dwindled.
Dwindled, but it was never devoid of Jews.
Right. There was never a time when there were no Jews there. I think that's a very, very valid point. But there were times when it dwindled down to a small number. And of course, there were times when Jews were not in power. I think that's the point that's being made. Now, the main devil's advocate, in other words, the main counter argument that anti-Israel, that supporters of anti-Israel sentiment would say would be, hold on a second. Let's say you guys even lived here completely, right? All the back to whatever it was, were there people there before you? Yes. You conquered it from them? Yes. Okay. So then there were those that conquered it from you. So in the 1900s, in 1948, what gives you the right to declare independence and make a new state? There are other people in control, and that's it. That is what it is. Anyways, I'm not saying I agree with all these things, Joanne. I'm just trying to present the devil's advocate. Most importantly, I'm leading up to the question that we just asked, which is, how do we make sure, because I would imagine, just based on her comment in her article, that Phyllis Bennis knew most of these points. And she just had a counter argument, whether the ones that we mentioned in this class or other ones, to each of those points. The reason I say that with such certainty is because she says that her old Judaism was all her upbringing, her Jewish upbringing was revolved around Israel. Now, granted, a lot of that was probably just cultural, like planting trees in Israel and supporting Israel, sending money to Israel, etc. But presumably some of it was education. She seems to be a well-educated woman, and it took her realizing certain elements about Israel in order to turn against Israel. So what was there that was wrong in her education? What was missing? Everybody with me? Any other questions before we dive into answering that question? Okay, to clarify, the main reason we're asking this question is because we have a much deeper question, which is, what can we do today to educate Jews, right? To educate Jews to make sure that they are not having these same two mistakes. Okay, the way that I understand Phyllis Bennis, I think the mistakes boil down to two things. Number one is there was a crucial element missing from her Jewish education. From her Jewish education, and even the way she describes it, it seems that her Judaism was all about, social justice, anti-colonialism, other ideals of liberalism, and that was turned into what Judaism was all about. I think that was the first mistake, that her Jewish education was sorely lacking in what actual Judaism is all about. She actually mentions that God wasn't mentioned often in her Jewish upbringing and her religious childhood. And number two is that what she was taught about Israel, which was a huge part of her education, was taught through a very specific set of lenses. And that is Israel, hold on a second, right? This quote This is actually a great quote. I was just about to skip over it, so I'm glad that the slide has it. There is a story where someone once wrote to the Rebbe. He was decrying, he was protesting an incident that he witnessed. What was the incident? That a Jew came to shul to help make a minyan, probably schlepped off the street or something like that, right? And instead of praying, he was reading from a newspaper, right? So the Rebbe, this is terrible. Like, what's he doing in shul, reading a newspaper? He wants to read a newspaper, let him go somewhere else. We don't need a Jew like this as part of our minyan, etc. And the Rebbe took the exact opposite approach. The Rebbe responded that his perspective of the incident is very different than the person who was writing to him. Instead of focusing on how wrong it is to be reading a newspaper instead of davening, says the Rebbe, we can instead choose to focus on the fact that this Jew is in shul and how sad it is that he didn't receive a proper Jewish education, because clearly the flame is there. Clearly the spark is there. He came to shul. 9 other Jews want to pray, and he says, you want to pray? Of course I'll help you with a minyan. And the Rebbe pointed out that how sad is it that flame, that spark that is there, wasn't nurtured. Every Jew is born with that spark. Every Jew has that. And if it isn't nurtured, in other words, if you don't receive a proper education in your childhood, then it can lead to very sad results. Whether that's somebody like Phyllis Bennett saying that she doesn't support Israel. And we'll talk soon about how that directly relates to not having a proper Jewish education. And number 2 is or whatever. Another example of that is that you come to shul and you're in shul because you care about Judaism, but you don't know how to daven. It's a fascinating perspective on how we judge other people when they do something wrong. Anyways, leaving that aside. So number 1 is Jewish education is very key. Number 2 is the education which Phyllis Bennett did receive, and which many Jews, by the way, till today, receive about Israel, unfortunately, is very often narrowed to a very specific lens. And that is Theodor Herzl kind of Jewish Israel, a Theodor Herzl perspective on Israel. What do I mean by that? Israel is introduced, and I think this is what Joanne was referencing, at least in part earlier. Israel is introduced as something that arrived in the 1900s, right? Or in the 1800s. In the 1800s, there was a Zionist movement. In 1948, the state of Israel was established, and it is our responsibility as Jews to support this state of Israel. Instead of Israel being introduced, as we'll elaborate shortly, as the ancient homeland of the Jewish people, there isn't that much emphasis on that. Much of the emphasis is on the modern state of Israel. So in terms of the first shortcoming, I think it's important that we provide a robust Jewish education, a general Jewish education, not just about Israel, about God. It should explore Judaism comprehensively. Talk about God. Hold on just a moment. Let me just move this out of the way. Let it be rooted in faith in God. And this is a general mistake that we make often in educating Jewish children. We spend so much time on very specific things that we want them to be doing, but we don't talk about the ideology behind it, right? In other words, it would have been okay, it would have made perfect sense for Phyllis Bennett to come to the conclusion that colonialism or that human rights violations are a terrible thing, but she should have been coming to that conclusion from a Jewish perspective, not from a non-Jewish perspective. Why is it that the education that she's getting about anti-colonialism and human rights abuse, right? Why is all that education coming from other places? Judaism talks about that. Judaism talks about being honest and moral people. In the other parts of Jewish education, which are extremely crucial when bringing up Jewish children, faith in God, belief in God, how that ties into the way we act as godly people, as people who believe that God is watching everything we do, and that therefore we have to act in honest and moral in moral fashions. If you're missing that, and all you're getting out of Judaism is Israel, we have to support Israel because it's the state of the Jewish people, then you're missing the bedrock of it. And number 2 is, Israel has to be presented to children the way it is presented in our Torah. For starters, This means deepening our appreciation to the concept that Israel is our land because God gave us the land, as is famously stated in the first Rashi on the Torah. Elise, can you read for us, please? Text 6.
Okay. Rabbi Yitzhak stated, the Torah should have begun with the first mitzvah commanded to the Jewish people, which is contained in the verse. This month shall be to you, etc. For what purpose does it start with? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The solution is found in the verse. He recounted the strength in his works to his people to give them the inheritance of nations. In other words, if the nations of the world accuse the Jews with the claim, you are thieves for having conquered the lands of the 7 nations, the Jews should reply, the entire world is God's. He created it and granted it to whoever he desired. It was his will to initially give it to the 7 nations, and it was his will to subsequently remove it from them and give it to us.
Just as anti-Israel or the nations protest, the nations of the world protest against the Jewish people and their claim to the land of Israel has been constant, so has the answer always been right here. We should stop with all the excuses. In other words, not that any of those claims are wrong. The historical claim to the land of Israel is a valid claim. The international legal claim to the land of Israel is a valid claim. The claim that's the best way for Jewish survival is a valid claim. Those are all very good claims. But because they're logical, they fall within the realms of logic. We're fighting a losing battle here. If someone is bent on hating Israel and has something else going strongly, they're just going to find counter arguments to those things. We have to start to give the true reason. It's like trying to think of an example. It's like in a social situation when someone gives an excuse for not wanting to come to someone else's party or to go out to dinner with them or whatever it is, right? And we'll often give 6 different excuses that are not the actual reason why we don't want to go. And inevitably, people see through those excuses. Why? Because, I'm too tired. That's a great reason. If you were actually too tired and that was the real reason you're not going to the social event that night, then you would get out of it. But you're clearly doing other things that are showing that that's not the real reason. So the person sees through it. I promised someone else I was going to go to their party. All the different reasons that we give, and that's why people often see through these excuses for social excusing from a particular social event or commitment or whatever it is. When you give the real reason, all of a sudden people say, "Oh, okay, I respect that." Similarly, with regards to our claim to the land of Israel, we should remember that when God created the world, that makes God the balabas over the world, makes God the owner of the world. And if he chooses to give a particular piece of land to the Jewish people, that land is ours. The answer has been around since the year 1738 BCE. That's almost 4,000 years. Heidi, can you continue with text 7? Hashem promises the land of Israel to Avram.
Okay. Eternal covenant. God told Abraham, raise your eyes and look around from where you are to the north and south, to the east and west. All the land that you see, I will give to you and your offspring forever.
This was just one example. After that, Hashem promised the same thing to Yitzchak and then to Yaakov. And then when Hashem redeemed the Jewish people from Israel, he renewed the promise, and then he led them to the land of Israel, etc., as is mentioned in the Torah. So if it's Hashem's world, and he chose to give us a piece of the land, then this gift is eternal, just like God is eternal. Now, will this be enough? Okay, hold on. So just to summarize. Number 1, if Torah and God are exciting, relevant, and meaningful, and then based on that, right, notice the building blocks here. Based on that, we have education about Israel. That Israel is what? Not a state that started in 1948, not a political movement that started in the early 1800s, but rather Israel is a godly land that is given to the Jewish people. That will automatically lead to a Jew having a proper identity with the land of Israel and less anti-Israel activity. We have mentioned before, I believe, a letter that the Rebbe wrote to one of the presidents of Israel, Mr. Zalman Shazar. There's a lot of fascinating things in that letter. The primary purpose of the letter is to explain the Rebbe's reluctance to calling Israel the state of Israel, rather calling it the land of Israel. And this is specifically to counter this type of education about Israel. It's not a modern invention, rather it's our ancient homeland. Calling it the land of Israel and not the state of Israel immediately emphasizes this. But take a look at what else the Rebbe says to Rabbi Zalman Shazar, Rabbi, to Mr. Zalman Shazar. Shana, can I ask you to read, please, for us, text 8?
Sure. I have complaints. Why do I invoke the biblical land of Israel, the Holy Land, and the covenant with Abraham in connection with modern Israel? Why do I mix God into the picture? After all, they say those who fought for the creation of the state, those who led it, those who currently direct it, and its authorized representatives, they all proclaim and take pains to emphasize that Israel is a state founded in 1948. My answer, put frankly, is that their narrative is false. No new entity was created in 1948. Rather, that was the year in which a large part of the land of Israel was liberated. An entity established in 1948 based on the agreement or authorization of the nations of the world has no strength or justification in terms of an authentic response to the claim. You are thieves for having conquered lands belonging to others, etc. A claim raised by the Arabs, the Vatican, United Nations, and some Jews as well. This is why it is so crucial to underscore that it is our God-given homeland. Now, I do not delude myself into imagining that these just and honest arguments will prevail in the United Nations, the Vatican, etc. Nevertheless, transmitting this truth is critical for the morale of Jewish youth living in the Holy Land, including those serving in the IDF, for Jewish American students, and for the Jewish youth of other countries as well.
Thank you, Shana. It is important for us to emphasize to Jews, whether it be Israeli soldiers, Jewish youth on a campus at the age of 8, right, in Hebrew school, that when we teach children, when we educate children, when we talk about Jewish education, it's not just about it being Hebrew school. Hebrew school meaning emphasis on the Hebrew. You need to know Hebrew because if you're going to go to the land of Israel, you're going to talk Hebrew. On it being education about Israel, this new state that started in 1948. We have to stop talking about a land with so much promise and talk much more about the fact that it is a promised land. We have to teach about the covenant, the treaty that Hashem made with Avraham Avinu so many years ago, and stop talking so much about international treaties that particular legal bodies made with the Jewish people. We have to start to focus on a robust Jewish education that starts from the ground up. And I say this to you, of course, also as a rabbi, as I always do, because knowing your identity is the key to defending it. But also because directly when it comes to Israel, we see clearly that other things don't work. If someone doesn't appreciate, how can Phyllis Bennett say in the same article that we weren't taught that much about God and then say she's anti-Israel? Those two facts are not unrelated. They're directly related. Had she been taught about Israel through the lens of belief in God, the whole thing would be different. The whole thing would be different. This wouldn't be a conversation about a particular state, a particular political perspective. Did Theodor Herzl write like this or did not write like this? Honestly, Theodor Herzl becomes a much, as important as of a historical figure as he is, he becomes a much smaller element of the Israeli conversation when you view Israel as being a land, not just a modern state, a land that belongs to us for thousands and thousands of years. Can it have some effect on some non-Jews? Possibly, hopefully. I don't know that we're ever going to convince every single non-Jew that there is in the world that the Jewish people have a godly right to the land of Israel. But I think that if we were educating our own in this robust manner, then it would have a much deeper effect on them. Not just, it wouldn't just be a superficial thing that they were told that you're supposed to support the land of Israel. There would be meaning to it. There would be understanding to it. And I actually believe that if it's someone that would have become an anti-Israel advocate, joining in anti-Semitic anti-Israel advocacy, instead they would become, like many legitimate, beautifully educated Jews today are, people who can support the state of Israel and the land of Israel, and criticize the government for particular policies. There are many Jews in Israel themselves, in Israel itself, that do this from a non-anti-Semitic perspective. And they would never join an anti-Semitic agenda-driven movement. I hope that last distinction was clear. In other words, if the criticism, for instance, I myself have criticism of the Israeli government, as I'm sure many of us on the Zoom do, but that criticism often comes steeped in the Torah, based on the Torah. How can the Israeli government do X, Y, and Z if the Torah says that we should be doing X, the opposite? Right? The difference in approach is tremendous. It's a difference between someone who knows their identity and is willing to take criticism about themselves to someone who doesn't even realize who they are and then joins an anti-themselves movement. I cannot overstress that distinction. Okay. But, hold on. Let's pause for questions. Any questions? Yes, Heidi, go ahead.
So the argument could be made that just because it says so in the Torah, and if there are people, which there are many, who do not study or accept or ascribe to the Torah, like you could say to somebody else, well, it says so in the Torah, and they could say, well, who cares? Those aren't my rules. That's not my book.
You're talking to other Jews or to non-Jews?
No, to non-Jews, like to make the argument, it says so in the Torah, they could say, who cares? That's not my religious text.
So for starters, I would point out that most people that are critical of Israel, beginning with the Muslim people, believe in the Torah. They do agree with what it says in the Torah. Obviously, the Christians, and that's why there are many Muslims and Christians that are very pro-Israel. Many more Christians than Muslims, but still. And I wouldn't take away from your point. Your point still stands. We're not going to be able to convince every non-Jew in the world about this. Not every non-Jew is all of a sudden going to start believing in God. Not just because they believe in God, but they believe that God gave us the land, right? I think it would work on a great many non-Jews, but today I'm particularly talking about young Jews. And I think there the point stands 100%. I also don't know that it's our job to convince every non-Jew in the world that the land of Israel belongs to us. Obviously, we need to protect ourselves, right? And often that ends up in endangering Jews. And then for sure we need to speak up and we need to educate, etc. But to convince I don't know that we're ever going to accomplish that until Mashiach comes. So I don't know that it's our job. Just like eradicating anti-Semitism, we said, it's never going to fully disappear. We can mitigate it. We can learn to stand for something like that. We don't fall for everything. But entirely disappearing, that's saying evil is going to be eradicated from the world. There's always going to be evil in the world, right? I don't think you'll talk to a single cop in the world who believes that it's his job to stop murder from existing in the world. Evil is going to exist. I think it's part of, and we can have a whole philosophical conversation about why evil does exist in the world, why God would create the world and have evil, right? What we could do is make sure that evil has no place in our circle. Mitigate it. Make sure that we're not falling in, or that we're having a positive impact on the world around us. Making sure that evil is not a resident in that part of the world. Does that make sense? I hope that's not, I didn't mean to kill any dreams here of getting rid of evil in the world. It's going to happen when Mashiach comes. But I hope I didn't dash anybody's hopes of being that idealistic. Maybe there are cops that believe it's their agenda. They're part of a larger movement to get rid of murder and theft and crime in the entire world. Right? But there's a certain element of that that's going to have to be godly. That's the Jewish belief. Shayna, you had a question?
Yeah, I have. But I think our job is to speak to Jews who
primarily
off the chart in terms of God and the land and the Torah. They don't believe that. They've never read that. They've, assimilated, and they've lost a good bit of their heritage. But it's not totally lost. They can get it back. It's just, how do we speak to them and how do we convince them?
That was exactly my question.
Okay, so we mentioned one point already.
Okay.
I don't know that works for 40-year-old Jews. I mean, I think it does, if done properly, to educate them, starting with a proper Torah education, and then build an education on Israel on that Torah education. I think for sure, if we're talking about the next generation, it has to start based on that. I have 15 minutes left in the lesson that we're going to talk about one more major point.
I'm going to sign off. Thank you. Because I have an appointment.
No problem.
Okay,
So you'll catch the last 15 minutes later. But Shana, I did want to address one other question, which you didn't ask out loud, but you asked in the comments. I just read it now. And that is the issue of religious anti-Zionism, right? Did I understand your question correctly?
That's right. Yes.
Okay. I think for starters, we are now much more educated about Israel as it is from a Torah perspective. And we can appreciate, hold on, I need to plug in my laptop. We can appreciate that there might be a major difference. I don't believe that there is a single religious anti-Zionist that would tell you they are anti the land of Israel belonging to the Jewish people. If they are, then they are inherently not religious. They're denying the fact that Hashem gave the land of Israel to the Jewish people. For the most part, religious anti-Zionists find themselves in the Satmar sect. And I think it would be wise to quote. I have one here. Hold on. I wrote it down because I had a feeling that this was going to come up. In a Satmar printed biography of the Satmar Rebbe, the Satmar Rebbe is quoted as stating that when American Jews oppose the Zionist state, they show that they are anti-Semites. And this is because there was a very big difference between, hold on. There was a very big difference between, I have two more points which may clarify some questions you can ask. Number one, there was a very big difference in the Satmar approach even to the state of Israel before it was founded and after it was founded. If you're interested in their ideology, it is primarily built around 2 or 3 things that they felt the establishment of the modern state of Israel did, which is antithetical to Torah and antithetical to their beliefs. Number one, that the state of Israel was founded by secular Jews, and that the agenda was that secular Judaism should survive, so anti-Torah. Number two, that there were those religious Zionists that perceived it as the beginning of Mashiach coming, which they viewed as antithetical to their religious beliefs. There were a couple of other smaller issues. So that changed tremendously once the state of Israel was established. Because once the state, there's a difference between being against a movement that establishes a state, or after the fact saying, whatever, we lost that battle, something happened that we would have rather not happen, right? But now the question is, what is our approach to that state? They may not support it, they may not actively support it, they don't believe in giving money to the state, because it's antithetical to their Jewish beliefs, whatever it is, but they would never say anything anti to it. And this leads me to the other point, which is, it's very unfortunate, but this is the way of the world. We have to remember that it doesn't make a difference if it's 5 people. They can make a headline, and that often casts a shadow over a large group of people. Satmar suffers from this tremendously. There is a subgroup, not just in the Neturei Karta, even in the Neturei Karta are not necessarily pro-Iran and believe that every Jew that supports Israel has to be killed, etc. There is a subgroup of Satmar. I think they're called Lev Tahor. They're the ones that went to Iran. They're the ones that believe in siding with Iran, delegitimizing the state of Israel, destroying the state of Israel if at all possible, etc. I would call those people Meshuggayim. I wouldn't call it an ideology. And they're such a small minority. We're talking about less than 100 people. And if you take a look at some of the other things that they do, they are run much more like a cult than like a religion. And I can give a whole class on that, by the way. Religion is often confused with cults. and they're not the same at all.
I'd like to take that class.
Okay. And now is not the time for that. We still have 15 minutes of the class to do. And I'm trying to just answer your question. And unfortunately, Satmar often gets judged through that lens, which is why I took the time to quote from a Satmar book, quoting the Satmar Rebbe, saying that American non-Jews who oppose the Zionist state show that they are anti-Semitic. I think that's a very, very strong point. This comes from someone who did not believe in supporting the state of Israel, who believed the state of Israel had also, I would venture to say that he would posit the Satmar view of anti-Israel much more as criticism of Israel and the state of Israel rather than anti-Semitic. Okay, but let's leave that as it is. It's certainly not the Chabad view. Chabad supports many aspects of the state as well. Okay, in the last 15 minutes of the class, I just want to take this a drop deeper. And I'll call to mind last week. Last week, we spoke about the metaphysics of anti-Semitism, and then we spoke about the underlying, perhaps unconscious drive. We called it then the ditch complex that bothers anti-Semites. What I'd like to do today is to appreciate the same underlying subconscious psychological issue that many Jews or non-Jews that claim to only be anti-Israel, but if you would actually examine it, are anti-Semitic. What is going on at a much deeper level? And we'll start off by asking two simple questions, which nobody asked me, but we quoted a Rashi, where Rashi says that the reason why, excuse me, the reason why, right, so on the surface, why should the Jews claim ownership of this land? On a deeper level, why should the Jews claim ownership of this land? What's really lying behind it? Okay. I want to start off with two questions. We quoted a Rashi as explaining that why does the Torah start with Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim v'et haaretz? In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. And Rashi explains because this is the answer to any nations in the world that will come and claim that Israel doesn't belong to the Jewish people. God created the world; He owns the whole world, and therefore He can gift one particular land to one particular people. We didn't bother asking the other two questions. Number one, why should the Torah even dignify the nations with an answer? And number two, isn't it odd for the Torah to begin with this? Usually, if somebody is standing in court, right? You start off by stating your case, then you defend your thesis, right? You don't start off with a defense. That's usually like a bad sign. Isn't it odd for the Torah to start off by giving us an answer to the nations, which why the Torah is even dignifying the answer? Let rabbis throughout the generations come up with the answers for how to defend the Torah as being true. You state what the truth is, right? It's such a strange thing. And the Rebbe explains that the reason for this is because anti-Israel claims are actually rooted in something valid. Just as anti-Semitism is rooted in something positive, a void within the anti-Semite, he doesn't feel like he's fulfilling his mission in life, therefore he has to destroy those that are. Similarly, the hatred of Israel starts with something positive or something legitimate within them. And the Rebbe goes on to explain that the forming of a nation and the forming of Israel are very, very different from each other. And understanding that difference is key to understanding what bothers someone that becomes anti-Israel. Other nations are bound primarily by geography. The Jewish people, while we have a geographic location, that's not what makes us a nation. The Jewish nation, of course, is bound by Torah. If I were to ask any of you when the Jewish nation was formed, most of you would say at the foot of Mount Sinai, right? And then later on, there's a land that's attached to that. And the question is, what role does that land play? Let's start off by quoting Rabbi Sadia Gaon. Mickey, can I ask you to read, please, for us? Text 9, page 100.
The Jewish nation, should I start with the deeper claim?
No, nationhood.
Nationhood, okay.
Go ahead.
The Jewish nation is only a nation through its Torah. Continue.
So this is Rabbi Sadia Gaon, right? And the Rebbe expounded on this thing from a historical perspective. Yeah, Mickey, why don't you finish off?
Okay. The secret of Jewish immortality. An objective, unprejudiced survey of the long history of our people will at once bring to light the reality that our survival as a nation was not the result of material wealth or physical strength. Even during the most prosperous times under the united monarchy of King Solomon, the Jewish people, as well as its country, were materially insignificant by comparison with contemporary world empires such as Egypt, Assyria, and Babylonia. Nor was it our active statehood or the control of our geographic homeland that secured our existence, as is evidenced from the reality that for the vast majority of our history, our people have lived in exile, without a kingdom and without a homeland. Similarly, our Hebrew language did not play a vital role in our perpetuation, for even in biblical times, Aramaic supplanted the Holy Tongue as the spoken language, to the extent that parts of the scripture, almost all of the Babylonian Talmud, the Zohar, and other key works are composed in Aramaic instead of Hebrew. Later, in the times of Rabbi Sadia Gaon and Maimonides, most of the Jewish masses spoke Arabic, and further down the line, it was Yiddish and other languages. It is also impossible to ascribe any common secular culture or contemporary scientific knowledge as a major preservation factor for our people, since such matters morph radically from one area to another. The only remaining consideration, which is the sole factor that has remained consistent throughout the ages in all lands and under the fullest diversity of circumstance, is the Torah and mitzvot that the Jews have observed in their daily life with great self-sacrifice.
Thank you, Mickey. I found this letter to be fascinating. I had never seen it before preparing for this course, and I just want to elaborate on it for a moment. Judaism, or let's talk about it this way, what makes Jews Jewish is not the land of Israel. And that's, I think, one of the major issues that even Phyllis Bennis herself is saying in her article was wrong with her Jewish education. The deep understanding of the Jewish nation is to appreciate that it actually defies lands. It defies geographical borders, as our history proves. It defies languages, as our history proves. I just want to say that there's a multi-million-dollar industry out there, which is the industry that translates Jewish literature from one language into another language. And it's an industry that's existed for thousands of years. Okay? I read Rabbi Shamshon Raphael Hirsch, for instance, today, and I'm reading a Hebrew text, his commentary on the Chumash, which was originally written in German, because that's what he was writing for the local Jews. I read Maimonides, which is a 1,000-year-old text. I read it in Hebrew when it was originally written in Arabic. The Gemara, I happen to read in Aramaic. I happen to understand Aramaic. But there are those that don't. So therefore, they read it in Hebrew. It's been translated to Hebrew, or in English, right? And we are all familiar with the multi-million-dollar industry today that spends so much time translating more and more and more texts from Hebrew into English, such as the Jewish Learning Institute. We just read text that was originally written in Hebrew, but is being translated to English. Why is that? Because the Jewish people have always defied or surpassed the limitations of languages. Our literature has continued with us from Sinai, going through so many different languages. Even the Rebbe's novelty or novelty, etc., all of his Torah thoughts, etc., are primarily written and conveyed in Yiddish. So it hasn't been about a particular language. It hasn't been about a particular land. And as we know for sure, it hasn't been about a particular culture, right? Today, you're considered a modern hip and with a Jew if you have a smartphone and a social media account, and through there, you're Jewish, right? But 500 years ago, you would have been considered a hip and smart and with a Jew if you would have been whatever it was, right? Your Judaism would have been expressed in a different way. Sometimes Jews were more communist, sometimes they were more socialist, sometimes they were more capitalist. As we know, it definitely hasn't been a particular culture. So if it defies everything, and as we know, there is one thing that it doesn't defy, which is the Torah, and it's always been rooted in the Torah. It's always been connected to the Torah from our nation's founding down to every single day. Today, what makes us Jewish is the fact that we have a Torah. That is the identity of the Jewish people. So then why does Hashem give us a land? Why does it have to be tied to a physical place? Once you guys are unmuted, Joanne, why don't you read for us text 11, the lay of the land? No, you're good. You're good.
The response to this is that the relationship between the Jewish people and the land of Israel is unique. It is not comparable to the relationship between any other nation and its homeland. Rather, the Jewish land is an integral part of the Jewish people's spiritual mission. The ultimate goal of the Jewish people's divine service is to turn this tangible world into a home for godly revelation, to the point that God's holiness dwells specifically in the physical reality of this world. For this reason, the majority of the Torah's commandments involve physical activities, so that the fulfillment of Torah and mitzvot installs sanctity into tangible materials. It was therefore critical to provide the Jews with the land of Israel, a physical land, and to provide them with an abundance of mitzvot that can be performed exclusively with this land. For this expresses the entire goal of the Jewish people and the purpose of the Torah, to conquer the physical dimension of the world and transform it into a home for God.
Thank you, Joanne. So if the Torah, if Judaism is bound by the Torah and not by a land, why does Hashem give us a land? This ties directly into, again, proper Jewish education, appreciating what the goal of divine service in this world is. Hashem gave us the Torah and didn't just say, keep it as a spiritual retreat for you to retreat to every once in a while, a space, a holy space where you go every once in a while to be holy, to be spiritual, and divorce yourself from the world, as other religions would have it. No, Judaism mandates, and that we see this in every single mitzvah, that we take godliness, we take that spirituality, we take that holiness, and we imbue the physical world with it. We bring the godly revelation into the physical world. It has to be one. Through mitzvahs, through studying Torah, we then take the world and make the world godly. As the Rebbe once quoted, God gives a Jew materialism. Why? In order that he take that materialism and turn it into spirituality. This is something that the Jewish people as a nation are different from every other nation in the world. And this is the function of the land of Israel within that nationhood. Not we need a geographical space where to live. For thousands of years, we lived many Jews, and honestly, since the beginning, there have always been Jews, just like there have always been Jews in Israel. There have also always been Jews outside the land of Israel, keeping Torah and mitzvahs and being good Jews. So what is the Jewish space about? The Jewish space is about being a compatible a physical embodiment of the mission of the world. Conquer the physical. Take those physical things, turn them into spiritual manifestations of God's will in this world. Transform the physical world into a home for God. Let me do that slide again because it's a beautiful slide. Take the physical land, along with the physical things that the land gives you, and transform them into a home for God. And for this purpose, it doesn't matter so much how many Jews live in the land of Israel. And that's why when people start to say, as I did when I was playing devil's advocate to Joanne, there hasn't always been a major Jewish presence in the land of Israel. It doesn't make a difference how many Jews live in the land of Israel. What matters is that there is a land that is holy. And this is something that's very, very hard to understand if you don't have the underlying element, which is Jewish education. if you don't have the deeper understanding of God, the Torah, our mission in this world, then of course you're not going to understand what role Israel plays in terms of the Jewish relationship to it. And that's why the Torah was happy to answer the claim of the nations of the world, because it's not just nations of the world. It's a claim that essentially every single one of us can ask if we're not educated properly. And that's why the Torah, quote unquote, changed itself, started off instead by explaining that God created the world in order that we appreciate that God, the same God for whom we're trying to transform the physical world into a home for God, that same God wanted us to have a physical land. He gave us the physical land. He created the whole world in order to give us the physical land, in order for us to transform it and the rest of the world into a home for God. This is obviously most accomplished, an enhanced accomplishment, if you will, today, when there's not only a Jewish space, but with that Jewish space, there's a Jewish society that lives within that space. So to conclude, Rabbi Yehuda Halevi, one of the most famous Jewish poets, famously said, in what I think is actually his most famous poem, he says, Libi b'mizrach v'ani b'toch ma'arav. Rabbi Yehuda Halevi lived physically in Spain. He says, my heart is in the east, but I am in the west. Physically, I am in Spain, but my mind is with the Jewish ideal of taking physical land and making it holy land, taking physical items and making them spiritual, transforming the world into a godly place. We can all be that way. Of course, we should have a powerful and palpable love for Israel, but we should appreciate that love of Israel has to begin with a firm foundation of Jewish education, a firm foundation of a love for God, an appreciation of the Torah, etc. And until that happens, anti-Israel sentiment will continue among Jews. If our education about Israel is not based, is not based on a proper Jewish education, then we're missing the whole ball. We're missing the whole point. And until the anti-Israel threat is removed, we can continue to hope and pray for the coming of Mashiach, when the prophets tell us, Bila hamavet lanetzach, all evil will be eradicated from this world, including a hatred of Jewish people, anti-Semitism, and among them, anti-Israel sentiment, which leads to anti-Israel threats, etc., will be completely removed when Mashiach comes. May it be speedily in our days. Amen. Please turn your attention to the video screens for a brief overview of today's class.
Lesson 3, the Promised Land. 1. Anti-Semitism seeks legitimacy from the most prestigious authority of any given era. At present, this authority is the pursuit of human rights. Consequently, many of today's anti-Semites focus overwhelmingly on Israel and accuse it of being the ultimate violator of human rights. 2. When Israel is A, demonized, or B, judged with a double standard, or C, when Israel's existence is delegitimized, that challenge exposes itself as an expression of anti-Semitism. 3. When anti-Semites refrain from asserting that they seek to annihilate Jewry, but merely take issue with specific Jewish beliefs or practices, claiming them to be barbaric, Jews can be tempted to join the fight against their fellow Jews, believing that they are saving Jews rather than hurting them. 4. There are several arguments for why Jews need and have a right to Israel. Most crucial is the Torah's oft-reiterated reminder that God gave Jews the land of Israel as an eternal inheritance. The deeper our appreciation of this reality, and the more we educate the next generation about its implications, the more support we will nourish toward the land of Israel. Such an approach can desirably influence the wider audience, but the most vital audience is our Jewish brothers and sisters. 5. To support Torah and God-based reasoning, it is necessary to create an environment that cherishes the Torah and nurtures faith. It is therefore critical to provide a robust Jewish education to ourselves and to the next generation. 6. Jews are a nation not because of our land, but because of our Torah. Nevertheless, the land is important to the Torah's vision for the world inasmuch as it embodies the Jewish mission on earth, to infuse physicality with holiness.
Please join us next week for Outsmarting Antisemitism, Lesson 5, Lesson 4, and I should say this is the last lesson, Change of Heart.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you so much.